Today, the subject that we will be covering is really the IEP and the student study plans that many students qualify for and sometimes have to fight for, but ultimately the, the programs themselves can be immensely useful to parents and students as they go through different levels of education. We'll talk about maximizing the faculty or the parent-teacher meetings. We'll talk about the differences between the SST, the acronyms basically, and the 504. And then we will have an open Q&A. First, I would like to introduce myself, and then I'll introduce Dr. Seti. My name is Kevin Organichek. I'm the head of educational services here at Learnfully. My background is in educational psychology, and I researched second language acquisition and its impact on math and science outcomes in middle school students, which is funny to say now because I've been out of academia for so long. I realized that these things sound really, really specific and probably funny to most folks. I was an associate director of admissions at Ohio State University, and I am a family man. I have 4 kids, 2 of whom are neurodivergent, and they're all great. And I've been married for a long time, and I'm a dog lover. And Dr. Seti, let me introduce you, or let you introduce you.
Hi, I'm Robin Sati, life and academic coach and education consultant at Learnfully. I started off my career in the classroom teaching middle school science. I got my doctorate in STEM education and then stepped out of the classroom to do STEM education consulting for my own company. I am also an adult diagnosed autistic ADHDer and have made it a passion of mine to advocate for students so that they can have better access to all of the wonderful, wonderful educational opportunities out there. When I am not doing school-related things, I am often playing or talking about Pokemon. Or hanging out with my 2 kiddos. They are now 5 and 7.5. And I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Terrific. And Dr. Bradford sends her regrets. She may be joining late. She's having technology issues. So we will get started. Robin.
SSTs, 504s, and IEPs.
So the first thing that we want to cover is the school meeting, and that's the SST, right? The student study plan. That's where this is created, Robin.
Yeah, this is sort of the first step. The reason for the referral and meeting has shifted when a student needs because in the last several years there's been a significant need for social emotional learning and executive function support. There's also heightened awareness and increase in anxiety and depression diagnoses. Caregivers and educators both now require more training and coaching in social emotional learning and executive function now that we're more aware of them and aware of the need for support in a way that really we have not been throughout the history of public education. It is now even more important for learners to do an assessment, to create a learning profile, figure out what their strengths are so that we can figure out how to best advocate for our students. And goals are based on developmental milestones, which have not been adjusted since 2016. And so there's a lot of need for advocating for our students to make sure that we are to make sure that their goals, the goals that are set for them by their teachers, by their educators in their schools, meet their needs and are going to help them be the most successful. What is an SST meeting? SST is student study team. Typically, this is the first time you're discussing a concern that's not responding to tried solutions. And most classrooms will have a collection of solutions to try. Very often teachers and educators in schools will try anything in their power that they have the resources to provide to help students be successful. However, schools are often limited in what those resources are. And so this is the next step. This is when the student is not responding to these available solutions. SST meetings usually last 30 to 45 minutes and include a learner's caregivers, teachers, and at least one school representative, like the counselor, learning specialist, program director, or an administrator. Sometimes the learner is invited to attend, sometimes they're not. In this meeting, there will be discussions on any relevant background information, which could include both sides of the picture: what's going on at school, what's going on at home, what the students' strengths are, where there are areas of opportunity and challenge, like what's the problem, what is going wrong, what can we fix? And then start coming up with a plan of action and steps for follow-up. What can we do to help provide better access to the educational opportunities in this building for this student? Notes are taken, but it is not legally binding. This is the first step. This is where it all begins, and this is something that is often required in order to proceed to some of the more legally binding supports that we're going to discuss next.
So this is really the first step for self-advocacy as well. So although the notes are not binding, you should also, as a parent, keep very detailed notes of what is discussed, because ultimately you may have a lot of people helping to support your student, or you may have a lot of people that are other directed and they're supposed to be supporting your student. And so sometimes it's really important for you to remember that you have the largest interest in seeing your student succeed.
What is a 504 plan meeting? And a 504 is, you can think about it as the next step after an SST. Often, it's sort of the first level of legally binding accommodations. The name 504 comes from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is a federal law designed to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. So these individuals with disabilities would include your students that you're advocating for, and these programs that receive financial assistance include public schools. It can be after-school activities. Each 504 meeting includes the same participants as an SST meeting. Again, it's the next step in the same process. Sometimes an SST meeting is it. Sometimes there is no next step. Although, and this is something that you will probably experience if you find yourself down this road, schools often are limited in resources, and it is often easier to find a solution from an SST rather than proceeding into further steps. And so if you're told that 504 and IEP are not necessary, that doesn't mean the conversation is over. Keep advocating, keep pushing if you think that that's needed. A 504 meeting is designed to provide insights into the learner's strengths, areas of need, and accommodations or modifications either currently being used or being used in the future throughout. Now, if you have a student who is already receiving accommodations or modifications, there is still potentially benefit to having a 504 meeting, because if they are not written down in an official legally binding document, they can be taken away at any time. Now, again, I don't think teachers are out there to try to take away accommodations for children at every opportunity. There's very rarely any sort of malice or ill intention here, but there is a lack of resources everywhere. And if you want to make sure that your students' accommodations are protected, having a plan in place like a 504 or an IEP can make sure that happens. And so it's important to discuss what accommodations exist. It can also serve as evidence that those accommodations are working. If the student is doing great because of specific accommodations, that's a great foundation for these conversations, and a great place to start to say, hey, my student needs these accommodations because they are so successful with them. 504 meetings will have a similar format, and everything that's discussed is documented. Attendees' signatures are required and creates a legally binding document that are filed locally and federally. Again, if you have any sort of concern that your students' needs are not being met as it relates to their disability, then having a 504 can help ensure that those needs are being met.
Robin, I have a couple of questions from participants, if you don't mind, and we'll take them as we go here because they sort of connect the dots here. So one, is the SST legally binding, and what do I need to prepare for, or what do I need to prepare in advance of the SST meeting? Anything?
Excellent question. An SST is not legally binding. That doesn't mean that it's going to be ignored. Again, everyone wants students to be successful, but schools have lots of students, and sometimes it's difficult to make sure that all those accommodations are met. And so an SST is not legally binding. So just be around, be present, make sure that the accommodations are being met as needed, make sure the student is being supported, and keep up on progress, and pursue further if needed. And I completely forgot your next question, Kevin. Sorry.
Is there anything to prepare in advance? Like, do you need
Oh,
to
yes.
diagnoses or
Yeah.
things like that in
We're gonna cover preparation later in this
a
presentation.
bit? Okay.
And preparation for any of these meetings is going to be fairly similar.
And then the examples of what the student study team generates, would that be something like additional time for reading during the day, or like can you translate that
It can be
into like
any.
real?
It's whatever a school is willing to provide.
Okay.
It's what they're willing to provide. And again, I often sort of verbalize this in a way that sounds like everybody's out to get you and your child, and that is not true. But when it comes to advocating for students with disabilities, it can get messy. And as a teacher, I know that there are just 4,000 things to do all the time, and it's so hard to keep up with all of it.
Yeah.
An SST is whatever your school is willing to provide. It can be something like extra time for reading. It does not, it will not change academic requirements. That's going to come later when we get to the IEP. It's not going to, it does not necessarily affect the learning experience. It's more making the environment a little bit more accessible. So it can be, a little extra time. It can be, encouraging a student. It could just be a list of things that work to help a student, even if they're things that all students can do. It can serve as sort of a reminder, enshrining the things that works. Things that come to mind, allowing a student to go fill up their water bottle anytime they need to take a break, allowing a student to have a fidget tool with them, allowing a student to take a walk when they need to, allowing a student to spend time in a sensory friendly space, like a library, letting the student go to the library whenever they want, allowing, some flexibility when it comes to when and how assignments are handed in, but not likely to include flexibility with which assignments are handed in. But it can be something like, for a student who struggles with executive function, they may be allowed to type their assignment instead of handwrite it, or submit it later in the day, or get an extra reminder from the teacher to take it out of their backpack and actually hand it in.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's not legally binding, but and it's generally like what you and the school and the teachers are able to put together to advocate for the student. And sometimes it will be very difficult because teachers have many students and many requirements for their time. So it's important to take your own notes as a parent or a caregiver and be able to advocate as best you can for your student. And then we covered the 504, which is a legally binding document. And that will take us into what is an IEP meeting? And that's Robin, that's you again.
What is an IEP meeting? An IEP meeting is, you can consider it the most involved part of this process. It is It is often the end goal. Very often you will have to proceed through an SST and 504, which could take years to get to an IEP because that's what your student needs, and maybe the school is pushing back on it. But an IEP is where your student will get things that they need written down that must happen legally. This is, you know, it's still not the end of the process. There's still, you know, and we'll talk about that in terms of how to continue to advocate even once an IEP is in place. But very often there are many hoops to jump through. It can be scary and overwhelming, but it is something that has been done. Many students and parents have been through this before, have been through it successfully, and have found that this has made a huge difference in educational opportunities for their student. By law, the IEP meeting must be scheduled when a caregiver can attend. And this is an example of how the laws surrounding IEPs are stricter than with 504s, for example, where potentially if a parent can't make it, a meeting can still potentially proceed. An IEP meeting cannot proceed without a caregiver. The IEP is always presented in draft form at the meeting, and you do not have to sign it on site. It does need to be signed, but if you do not agree with something in it, you don't have to sign it. You can take it home and think about it. If you are someone who finds that in a high pressure situation like that, it's hard to make those decisions and think through those things, take it home and look it over later, ask around, speak to an advocate. But it does eventually need to be signed and agreed by all parties. Attendees have to include a caregiver, a general education teacher, and at least one special education teacher, a school or district representative, and someone to interpret the results of testing, which can be a psychologist, social worker. It can also include a special education advocate, and your student can attend their IEP meeting. Some more about, next slide, please. Some more information about the IEP. Parents are an equal part of the team here. And that is important because as a parent, you probably spend the most hours in a week with your child. You probably know them the best. You've known them the longest, certainly. You are going to know their strengths and weaknesses the best, which includes what are they able to do currently, but also how has this changed? What has changed over time? What is or isn't working? Because even a student teacher who's been with them for an entire school year, we're now approaching almost approaching the halfway point, I think, in a lot of schools. It's still only been 1 year, and so much can change year to year. You are going to have the best long-term view of what your student is capable of doing and what your student needs the most help with. You also are understanding in the long term how do they respond to different demands? What sort of thing is going to be a problem, even if it hasn't happened yet this school year or hasn't happened yet in a few years? What could potentially be a problem? What sorts of things are problems at home, and how can the teachers learn from that? Decisions on placement, services, and assessment can't be made without you. You will be part of the goal setting process. You want to consider goals should be realistic yet ambitious. Goals should be something that should be met, but it should be kind of hard. Goals should include milestones along the way so that we know if we are making progress towards those goals. An IEP will also include monitoring services and supports that are that you want to make sure are specifically for your child, not just what's easiest to provide, but what you think your child will benefit best from, and includes a discussion of are they being provided, especially at subsequent IEP meetings. And then an IEP allows for continuity over multiple years and requires an annual review by all of the parties involved.
So Robin, we do have one question here, and I had this question as well. So are these meetings set up? It feels like they can almost be adversarial at times. Like, is it the parents and the student on one side of the table and the school officials on the other side of the table trying to negotiate the least they can do to help the student, or is it the most they can do to help the student? How do these meetings feel?
That's my fault. That is not what it's like. I mean, it's I can't think of a great metaphor for it. No, it is mostly friendly. Everyone's on the same team. Everyone's trying to help out a student. I am hoping to help prepare you in case it is not like that, because I have spoken to most of the time, and I've sat in on IEP meetings um, as a teacher many times. Most of the time, we all want what's best for the student, and we are all willing to do that. Especially because, and this is maybe a bit of a cynical view of it, but really, when they say legally binding, they mean legally binding because the government provides funding for these supports in an IEP. And that's why an IEP will provide so many supports. And so while there are limited resources, IEP kind of helps provide its own resources to some degree. And so for the most part, everyone is on the same page. That said, a school may not know what the exact degree of challenges that a student faces, because it may be a teacher that has only worked with a student for half of a school year, or who only sees the student for an hour a day. They may not know, maybe the student masks perfectly in school and then comes home and it's a disaster, and the student needs supports during the school day so that they can be healthy and functioning all of the rest of the time. And so it is usually not adversarial, but sometimes it can be, and it is helpful to be prepared walking in with an idea of what you want and what your rights are in this process.
Right. Yeah, I think just remembering that we as parents are the biggest advocates for our position, taking notes, making sure that everything that's stated in a meeting is understood. That sort of behavior is important. So just self-advocacy. Robin, can you talk about the differences between all these things?
Sure, sure. Well, 504s and IEPs are have a lot in common, and very often students will have a 504 on the way to an IEP. Sometimes not. The biggest difference is that a 504 is accommodating the environment so that a student can participate in the educational activities as they exist. Whereas an IEP is how can we create systems within the educational system to support a student. So 504 is disability support so the student can participate in school. IEPs is modifications of instruction. So, an example that I can think of is a close friend of mine has an autistic daughter who is in second grade, and she has a 504 plan. They determined that since she did not have any cognitive and learning challenges, she did not qualify for an IEP. She was given a 504, which provides supports for her to leave the class, get extra support when she needs, get extra help when she needs, work on assignments on her own timeline, in her own choice of order, but does not have any additional educational services, no additional literacy or math supports, no modifications to the assignments. I have another friend who has an autistic child who has an IEP because that student even with all of the same supports found in 504, would still not be able to engage in the learning environment appropriately, and they receive additional supports in reading and literacy, in socio-emotional learning, which is additional resources, additional time outside the classroom. So the student spends more time outside the classroom, but receives additional one-on-one instruction that another student would not receive. One plan is not different, is not better than the other. It's what is going to best help a student, but the 504, for the most part, doesn't touch the instructional process, whereas an IEP includes additional resources, additional instruction. It can also include modifications of instruction, modifications of what the requirements a student needs to complete to pass a course,
Sure.
although does not necessarily include that.
Can one be on both a 504 and an IEP?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I would assume so.
Yes.
Also,
The answer is
504s
yes.
include.
I knew
That
the
seems
answer
like a
right
really
before I
obvious
asked it.
question. I'm sorry, I'm totally blanking out and cannot
No worries. Yep, that's
recall the answer. I also know that it's gotta be because I'm thinking of 504s also exist for disabilities that are not learning disabilities. So for example, if a student needs access to an elevator to get to their classes, that would be found in a 504. So I can imagine a student who has educational needs for learning disability and has an IEP, but also has let's say physical disability needs that would be covered in a 504 plan.
Got it. Right. So you said we are going to talk about
Yep, this is the good stuff. How do caregivers maximize in school meetings? How do we get the most out of them? How do we make sure that our students are getting the most? Again, I want to reiterate this. I want to say this over and over again. Most of the time, you don't actually need to do all these things. Most of the time, you're going to show up. They will explain everything. They will be wonderful. The school will be great. The special education teacher or social worker will help walk you through it, make sure you understand everything, and make sure that everything your kid needs is in place. Sometimes it does not happen that way. If you want to avoid potential challenges, preparing for the meeting is the best thing that you can do. Compose a list of questions ahead of time. And actually, you should do that anyway, regardless of whether you anticipate antagonism or not. Because, I think about it like going to the doctor. You can have a perfectly wonderful and attentive doctor, but if you forget to ask the questions, you're not going to get your questions answered. You also want to reflect on observations you've made of your child, both respect to schoolwork and behavior at home. And I don't mean behavior like good or bad. I mean behavior like seems happy and relaxed, or seems super wound up and hasn't spoken to anyone else all day, indicating potentially something's wrong or is not eating well or something like that. What are the things that they may not see at school that's helpful information? And so it's not about providing the additional information from home because they're trying to not, they're trying, it's not because they're trying to withhold supports necessarily. It's because they don't know. They don't see your kid at home. Similarly, make note of any concerns you might have. And I would recommend that if you are beginning to engage in this process, open up and start a Google Doc, something that exists on the cloud, so that wherever you are, when something comes up and you can think about it, you can just jot it down. Oh, my kid just had a meltdown trying to leave the supermarket. Once everyone's safely in the car, I'm just going to jot this down on my phone before I proceed, because I don't know about you, but when I sit down to think about all of these things in that moment, suddenly I can't remember any of them. And that's not necessarily problems. It could be, this is something my kid is really good at. It's amazing. Although those tend to be easier to remember. Note any concerns you have. again, that kind of goes in line with questions. And a concern could be, hey, I'm worried I'm not going to understand this. I'm worried that I won't get a chance to say my piece, or I won't be heard. And honesty there is can be really helpful. You want to gather any records of previous parent-teacher conferences and other educational documents. And this is, again, a note that if you are beginning this process, save that stuff, because notes that other teachers have made about a student's strengths and challenges can be really helpful. Again, there's no teacher that your student has right now who has seen them for years and years and years and years and knows them all day, every day. And so any documentation you have can be helpful. Additional voices sharing information. Take detailed notes and record the meeting on your phone if possible. Again, they're probably not out to get you, but it can be helpful. Also, if you're anything like me, you're going to walk out of that meeting and have no idea what just happened. Even if you got your questions answered, you advocated like a rock star, you walk out of there and suddenly your brain just falls to pieces. Having a recording can be really helpful. Ask for clarification about anything you don't understand. This meeting is the time to do that. It is sometimes hard to grab hold of somebody outside of this meeting, not always intentionally, just because things happen. Lots of things are going on in a school building, but that meeting is the best time to do it. That said, that's not the end of the world. If you have questions afterwards, you will have, you can still ask. And please feel free to ask, feel comfortable to ask. Either the teachers, the professionals at the school, or if you have a special education advocate, could be helpful for answering that. Ask questions, some examples of questions that you might want to ask. Ask questions about the curriculum and how students' work is graded. There are little things that you might not think could make a difference. But maybe the work is graded in such a way that doesn't illustrate your student's strengths properly. And maybe the student is doing really well in learning, but is not able to show it in the way that they're expecting. And so it's not just about what work is provided, but sometimes it's about how the work is graded. Of course, be compassionate and understanding with teachers and staff. They don't know your student like you do, but they do want the best for your student. But they also want the best for all of their students. And while those things do not usually conflict, sometimes they do. And it's just better. It's easier if we can remember that these people are all working to help these students. Education is not a career that someone gets into for any reason other than helping students. This is what they're there for. They're there to help. They're there to make sure that your student is as successful as possible, but sometimes there are competing needs. Sometimes there are limited resources. And very often that is not the intention of the teachers and staff. It is important to acknowledge, sort of like a last little tidbit here, it's important to acknowledge that your child's motivation and your participation as a caregiver is crucial to achieving success. And so it's not just about going through and checking the boxes, even though this is a checklist with boxes, but it's about being involved in the process, being engaged in the process, not just hoops you have to jump through for the sake of jumping through hoops, but working together as a team, working with this IEP team to create a plan that will help your student be the most successful. And that often includes input from the student, so that the student feels included in the process, not necessarily at the meeting. It could be through discussions beforehand and afterwards, but both of you and your student are active parts of this process, and it cannot succeed without you. So it's not just about showing up to the meeting, but ask the questions and push the buttons you need to do to make it work for you.
That's great. This is like a checklist for how to be a good advocate. So it's it should be helpful. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. These are suggestions of things that are really easy for me to say, but really hard to do in the moment and can be very, very, very challenging to do. But it's helpful to have the reminder because it is a room full of people who are all there to help students be successful over the long term. Establishing rapport can go, sorry, back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. Establishing rapport can go a long way towards getting stuff done. And this really works in all areas of life. But if you kind of go in expecting it to be adversarial and act accordingly, sometimes it can make it a little bit more challenging. That doesn't mean don't push back, but any bit of report you can establish either ahead of time or even in the moment can be helpful. Even so much as, what interactions have you had with your students' general ed teacher so far? Have they been, positive and supportive? Have you been, an active listener when the teacher has called with an issue? What sort of relationship do you have with these other people in the room? Read your audience to best advocate. That I can't give advice on that. That's not my strength. Assume best of intentions until proven otherwise. And that I cannot reiterate enough. I think that I have not been clear enough on that. Assume the best intentions until proven otherwise. And when proven otherwise, actually, I would say that if your instinct is to feel otherwise and to feel like they are out to get you or out to limit your opportunities, it's worth taking a step back and thinking, what are their intentions? Why are they doing this? It is, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it is very, very unlikely that a teacher just dislikes a student and is trying to punish them. It is not as common as my middle school students would have had you believe. Be an active listener and have an open mind to the best of your ability in this moment. And I don't want to discount the fact that this whole thing is scary and stressful and overwhelming, and it's going to be hard to do this. I can assure you that when the time comes that I am sitting in an IEP meeting for my own children, I will be crying almost certainly. But I will also be taking notes and I will also be recording so that I can go back to it later and maybe do the active listening later when I am better able to do that. And I'm going to try my best to assume the best and have an open mind. Do your homework. That sounds so mean. But but do your preparation, but also part of collaboration is not just saying the right things and smiling, but also if you've made an agreement, if you've told a teacher that you're going to have a conversation with your kid about something, hold up your end of the bargain. If you're expecting them to hold up their end of the bargain, you hold up your end of the bargain. And then follow up and keep your eyes on the prize. The goal is the kid at the end of the day. I know certainly as a teacher, I have definitely had to make decisions that that are not always the easiest with the goal of supporting a learner. And parenting that happens quite a bit too. Remember, there's a lot going on, but this can make such a huge, huge difference for your student. Directly after the meeting, and again, I'll qualify this with as directly after the meeting as is reasonably possible. Again, go home, have a cup of coffee, take a nap if you need, and then review the meeting notes, listen to the recording, and write down questions you have. Email all the participants. Again, we're working from a collaborative point of view here, so thanking them for their time because it is a time commitment. And then list the questions you have after reviewing the meeting notes. Make sure you've gone through the notes first. Some of the questions may have been answered while you were, having your own brain meltdown. But ask the questions, and you are entitled to ask those questions and have them answered. Based on that response you receive, you can either sign the IEP if you find that all questions are answered to your satisfaction and you have reviewed and agreed to all the notes, or you can request or schedule a follow-up meeting. And again, you are entitled to either of those things. And print and save all emails, they are documentation. Or just save them in a folder somewhere for someone who can't handle physical paper of things. But hang on to the emails, or even just store them in a Gmail folder so that you have them all together. They are documentation. Again, I don't want to say they're out to get you. Make sure everything's in writing. Don't talk over the phone or in person with your kid's teacher when you pick them up from school. But just in case, email's great. Phone and in-person conversations can be, let's say, can be inconsistently remembered by all parties. And so having the email documentation can be helpful. In terms of longer term follow-up, you'll want to keep track of the dates for each of the goals set in the IEP. You want to make sure to follow up based on the goals in the IEP in a timely manner, keeping track of these goals, making sure that they're being met. Request documentation towards each previously established goal. If you are showing up at an IEP meeting and you're told that a student is meeting their IEP goals, but you don't see it at home, request documentation. Similarly, provide proof or tell stories of how you are not seeing that at home. And if you have not signed the IEP, the previous goals remain there from the previous IEP, from the previous year's IEP.
That's a good tidbit.
What was one final piece of advice we want to offer caregivers? It's funny, when I was preparing for this presentation, the first thing that came to mind was that you are your child's best advocate, and you are going to be the one whose voice will carry even when there's pushback. But now, after having probably said that too many times, I would actually want to say, final piece of advice is to remember that everybody's goal is to help your student be successful. Excuse me. Everyone has your child's best interest at heart. But everyone has a different understanding of the situation and a different set of competing interests, competing priorities, I should say, which may potentially conflict. And so remember that you are your student's advocate. This can have such a huge, wonderful, important impact on their life. But at the end of the day, everyone is out there. Everyone out there is trying to help your student. And so work with them rather than against them. They want your child to be successful. If you feel like they are not moving in the right direction, pushing back will help them also see the child be successful. And that is, in the long term, what they want to see, even if there's potentially some friction along the way.
That's great advice. And thank you, Robin. So we'll open it up now. Feel free to unmute your mics if you have questions, or you can put them in the chat and I can read them. Either way. Chris, you had a lot of observations. Do you want to share anything?
I can see that. I can read what Chris has written. In some cases, it does become adversarial. Many parents who contact us say their school officials and counselors aren't really listening to their needs and seem to roll out boilerplate IEPs. Then they're not closely followed or implemented in the child's schooling, so an external tutor is hired to fill gaps. and to help make sense of the IEP goals and process. Yes, that absolutely does happen. It's it's sort of assume the best, but be aware that sometimes that is what happens, and you have the legal right to push back here. And Chris also says, and that is the cause of the problem when it does seem adversarial. Parents can expect the school should know and do everything, which isn't true. That is correct. The school does not know everything. They certainly don't know your child as well as you do. And while they should be doing what is legally required in the IEP, that doesn't always happen. And being able to kind of keep an eye with, documentation of progress towards goals, even just talking to your kid about it can go a long way. Also, collaboration requires objectivity, among other things. Objectivity is harder when involving your own kids rather than someone else's kids. No kidding. It is it is very, very challenging. Hence the many reminders that we are trying to we are trying, and we do the best we can as parents and as teachers. But I think just being aware how challenging it can be as a parent to be objective when it comes to your kids, just being aware of that can help with the process. Also, finding an advocate, of course, can also help for those who are struggling on their own.
Absolutely. So I think I said it so you can unmute if you want to ask any more questions, or you can put questions in the chat.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I see that now. Thank you. And thank you, Robin. I appreciate all of what you had said. Yeah, it's very much, we do a fair amount of tutoring for students who have IEPs, and sometimes with test prep, and that's where it kind of goes, what you said kind of takes it to that next level when it's SAT or ACT prep. But anyway, yeah, we do find that in some cases, the IEPs and other supporting documents are very well written. And usually in those cases, if they're well written and there's solid goals and such, usually the school as an organization tends to execute on them reasonably well. Obviously, the parents have to be willing participants, collaborators, if you will. In situations when you get an IEP and it looks like literally somebody was trying to get it done in 90 seconds before they, left the office for 2 weeks of Christmas break. Sort of one sentence things. It's not doing anybody any justice at that point. And we do see it. And it tends to kind of, at least in my area, kind of tends to cluster by schools. So I don't know if it's more of an administrative thing or just luck of the draw. But that we do see that from time to time. So then when somebody will call us from a certain school and we ask, are there any diagnosed learning, exceptionalities or anything, then we kind of go down this path and we go, oh, okay, well, we can help you. And so it's, yeah, really trying to be positive, because a lot of times parents will want to complain and they're just very frustrated and venting, and we're trying to not feed into that. We're trying to say, hey, there's sort of a third path here that we can help you with. Let's focus on the outcome, not the problem. And usually that's sort of a healing balm in the situation. But yeah, everything you said is so important. I think every parent ought to review that, at least once a month when it comes to their, advocating for their child.
I like that a lot. Remember the outcome. That's a really good way to look at it. Something else that I thought of that could be helpful when it comes to this is that great IEPs are out there and they exist. And while you certainly can't, Google all of the IEPs that have ever been written, if you as a parent are part of any communities of people who have kids with similar disabilities, ask them if they're willing to share, if they have suggestions. What are some goals that have worked for your student? What are some accommodations that have worked for your student? What are some 504 accommodations that have been helpful? And that can go a long way towards having something to walk into a meeting with, rather than just saying, this isn't it. Being able to say, actually, here are some ideas that might work, and remembering that we don't have to discover all of these things for ourselves. The information is out there.
And I think that's a very important point you just mentioned, Robin, is community. I think you touched on it earlier, and here you really amplified it. Is sometimes a lot of people feel like they're on their own, especially when they are dealing with the school and they expect the school to have all the answers and they're not getting it. They can feel very isolated. And we know that sort of the natural human response to that is a lot of frustration and anger. So if they get themselves into a healthy community, not one where everybody's, against, the system and all schools and are evil and all that mindset, if they get into a healthy community, that's one. So that might be one thing for people to look at. And I say this part of it mostly jokingly, but I can see a new app, Chat IEP or Chat 504, coming up with sort of now every student is individual, right? And it has to be based on observation of them. So you can't just use boilerplate. But certainly I could see where there could be, as you said, sort of if there's a database or a directory within community or even online, as to sort of what a good IEP sort of looks like or should accomplish, or how it is structured. Same with 504 versus not, right? And again, outcomes oriented, not just the words on the page, because that can be meaningless if they're not going to be applied. But anyway, there's your new idea of the day, Chat IEP.
That is an excellent idea. I like that a lot. I think another suggestion is don't be afraid of the diagnosis. There are a lot of words out there that sound scary, but very often a diagnosis can be your key to finding a community and finding a group of parents who are all dealing with the same challenges. Even better if you can find a bunch of parents who are dealing with the same challenges, but also include grown students who have been through this with those same challenges on their own and can tell you what has worked for them and what hasn't. And so lean on that, lean on those words, those Google search terms.
And those Chat IEPs.
It's excellent.
So thank you, Robin. That was outstanding. And I think we have a lot of really good information, and we've recorded this, so we should be able to share the web meeting once we're done with that.